Indeed, it's true that I used to be an intern at FCNL. It was actually my first internship. It was 1997, so 16, is that right? 16 years ago? Good God. And it was my first time in DC, as a matter of fact. I had this incredible excitement as I came through this town and saw all the amazing buildings and the statues. And I'd come to FCNL in particular to work on pushing through the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1997, a treaty that I was deeply impassioned about and very excited to be working with FCNL on this program. I remember my first day. This was in the days of Joe Volk, I'm sure most of you know, who's now traveling the world like some kind of crazy person. No, I'm just kidding. He's having a great time. I hear from him all the time, actually. I think he's in China right now. But what was remarkable about my experience is I remember my first day at FCNL, I thought, okay, this is great. I'm going to lobby and I'm going to change the world and bring down the powers. This is going to be fantastic. And my first assignment, Joe gave me a list of names and phone numbers. And I said, what's this? He said, well, you're going to call these people, and there's a vote that's about to take place, and you're going to tell them to call their Congress person and tell them to vote yes on this bill. And I thought, wait, I'm a telemarketer? That's, I thought I was going to like go to Washington and like fight, and I got to call poor people in their homes? This is the worst job ever. And he said, don't worry about it, just do it. And I said, well, what do I say? He said, just tell them that there's this vote that's about to take place and that their congressman may vote no. And I thought, this is crazy. I know how I react when people call me, in the evenings. This is going to be awful. So I sat down and I picked up the phone, dialed the first number, a very nice lady, probably in this room, answered the phone. And I said, ma'am, I am very sorry to be calling you in the evening. I'm calling from the Friends Committee, and there's this bill, HR 17-something. It's coming up, and your congressman's going to vote no. And I was when she goes, okay, what's the number? Excuse me? Give me the number. Give me the congressman's number. Yeah. Okay. All right. And I thought, well, that went well. Hung up the phone, called the next person, and this kept going. Like every person that I called, I couldn't even get past, I'm calling from FCNL before they said, okay, what do you want me to do? Who am I calling? And what am I calling about? It was my first sort of introduction to the Quakers. And what it meant, and it is an experience that has stayed with me ever since, and I am absolutely grateful and honored to 16 years later to be back here with all of you and to say how transformative that experience was for me. I didn't end up working on the Hill as I thought that I might, and as a matter of fact, it was Joe who discouraged me from doing so. He sat me down and he said, you don't want this job. And instead, I began to work as a scholar and a thinker, trying to write about the intersection of religion and politics, particularly with regard to the Middle East, in order to create some sense of understanding. But the lessons that I learned from being an intern at FCNL have stayed with me, not just in the work that I do now. I've been, for the last decade, a board member of the Plowshares Fund, and I know the Plowshares Fund, of course, works hand in hand with FCNL on a number of nuclear disarmament issues. But even in my scholarship, and even in sort of the mission that I've presented for myself, we talk a lot about the importance of building bridges between cultures, between religions, between peoples, building bridges of understanding. I think what I learned being at FCNL and what has really stayed with me ever since is that I am the bridge, that there is no bridge to be built. I'm that bridge. And that if we realize that we ourselves are the connection between peoples, between cultures, between religions, then I think we're much further along in a world of peace and security that we're all working for. Thank you very, very much for teaching me that. Now, a little bit about who I am. Some of you know, I was born in Iran. I left Iran in 1979 during the height of the Iranian Revolution. I often tell people that I came from a family of lukewarm Muslims and exuberant atheists. My mother was the lukewarm Muslim. My father was the exuberant atheist. In fact, my father was the kind of atheist who often had a pocket full of Prophet Muhammad jokes that he would pull out in inappropriate times. That kind of atheist, which actually worked to our favor in a weird way, because in 1979, when the revolution took place and the Shah was thrown out of power and Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran, if you recall, the promise that Khomeini made back then was that he had no interest in politics, that he was just going to go back to his home and back to his studies and leave the politics for the politicians. My father took one look at that and said, yeah, no, and decided that it would be a good idea for us to leave Iran temporarily while things settled down. That, of course, was 34 years ago, and it turned out that my father was right, something which he reminds me of on a daily basis. And we grew up mostly in the Bay Area in the early 80s. I'm not sure if you recall the early 80s, not the best time in the world to be Iranian or Muslim, as opposed to now when it's fantastic. It's been great progress. This was, of course, at the height of the Iran hostage crisis, 444 days in which Americans were held hostage in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. So anti-Iranian sentiment was pretty high, even in my little town in Northern California. In fact, I often admit that I spent a good part of the early 80s pretending to be Mexican. So, and let me tell you, you know that your particular ethnic community is in trouble when you assume Americans will treat you better if you say you're Mexican, because it turns out that's not the case. But nevertheless, it was kind of part of the experience of absorbing into American culture that really led not just me but my family, I think, to separate ourselves as much as possible from our culture, from our heritage, and certainly from our religion. I didn't grow up with a lot of religious instruction, but I've always been deeply fascinated by religion and by spirituality, despite the fact that, as I say, I did not receive any kind of spiritual edification in my family. We weren't a religious family even when we lived in Iran, and certainly when we arrived in the U.S., we kind of put away all of that. But I guess I would have to say that those childhood images of revolutionary Iran that I experienced, and the power that religion has to transform a society, for good and for bad, are lessons that never left me, even as a child. And so I'd always been deeply interested in religion and spirituality, though, as I say, I never really had an opportunity to explore that too deeply until I went to high school. When I went to high school, when I was about 15 years old, I went with a group of friends to an evangelical youth camp, and it was there that I heard the gospel message for the very first time. This incredible story about the God of the heavens and earth coming down in the form of a baby and dying for our sins, and that those who believe in him shall never die, have eternal life. I had never heard anything like this before in my life. It was one of these many transformative experiences that I've had in my life. I adopted this very particularly conservative brand of evangelical Christianity and began the next 3, 4, 5 years of my life preaching this gospel message to everyone that I met, whether they wanted to hear it or not, frankly. And then when I went to college, I went to a Jesuit university, Santa Clara University in the Bay Area. And when I went to college, I decided that this is what I was going to do. I was going to study the New Testament for a living. And it was at that point that I had an experience that a lot of people in my situation tend to have. When I was confronted with the Jesus of history and recognizing how different this Jesus seemed from the Christ that I had been introduced to by my church, this kind of celestial, heavenly figure with no concern over the cares of this world, whose sole interest was about divine salvation. A man who had no sort of political or social ambitions. That Jesus was so much different than the Jesus of history that I was studying in university. There was this great chasm between these two figures. And I suppose the best way that I could put it is that the more I began to study the Jesus of history, Jesus of Nazareth, the more obsessed I became with him, the more I wanted to get to know him. To put it in evangelical terms, I wanted to have a personal relationship, but with this Jesus, this guy, much more so than I think that I could have with the sort of celestial spirit that I had been introduced to in my church. And although I did separate myself from that evangelical Christianity and ultimately did return to the faith of my forefathers, I nevertheless continued over the next 2 decades to study and learn more and more about who this man was, over and beyond all the sort of theological claims that have been made by him. And that really became the impetus for this book. This book, which is often referred to as a political biography of Jesus, and that just drives me bananas when I hear that. This is not a political biography of Jesus. It is a reminder of something that everyone should already know, which is that every single religious word that came out of Jesus' mouth had political implications, because he lived in a world in which there was absolutely no difference between religion and politics. I don't mean to say they played in the same sphere. I mean that they were the exact same thing. That there was not one iota of difference between what you would call politics and what you would call religion. And so everything that Jesus said, which we, when removed from the context of his world, read in deeply spiritual terms, had deep, profound, and indeed revolutionary political implications. And this is a book that is meant to be a reminder of what those implications were. It is a reminder that whatever else you believe about Jesus, whether you believe he was God incarnate or the Son of God or the Messiah or whatever, you also believe that he was a man. That as a man, he lived in a specific time and place. And that time and place shaped who he was. It influenced his teachings and his actions. It's a reminder, and I keep using this word because these are things we should know. It's a reminder that his teachings were addressed to very specific social ills, that his actions were in confrontation to very specific religious and political leaders, and that indeed his teachings were so radical and revolutionary for his time and ours, as Michael reminds us, that he was ultimately put to death for them as a criminal as a state criminal. And so what I wanted to do was to introduce believers and non-believers alike to this Jesus, this extraordinary man. And I say that, believers and non-believers, because I really did have 2 audiences for this book. For believers, I wanted to, as I say, give them a clear indication of the consequences of the belief that Jesus was fully God and fully man. That too often we focus so much on the divine nature of Jesus that we forget about the human nature. Or if we do think about the human nature, he gets sort of subsumed. Thank you. He gets sort of subsumed by the divine nature. I don't know if you feel this way. I mean, I will just simply admit that when I was a Christian, I had a very, very difficult time making cognitive sense of the incarnation. And I get it, it's supposed to be a mystery. I get that. But let me tell you what I mean. What I mean to say is that no matter how much I tried to think about Jesus as hungry or scared or nervous or in pain or all of the things that we are supposed to think of him in his human nature, no matter how hard I tried to do that, there was always this nagging voice in the back of my head that said, yeah, but he's also God. I often refer to it as kind of looking at a tightrope walker who's got a net underneath him. It's just not that interesting. So he falls. Big deal. And for me, that always kept me from truly understanding the radical implications of what Jesus was teaching 2,000 years ago. And so what I was hoping to do, in a sense, was to give believers an opportunity to really understand that. You don't need to, suspend your belief. That's not what I'm saying. What I mean to say is that a result of your belief is in Jesus' humanity, and that belief has consequences. But I also had a second audience in mind. And that audience I refer to often as the sort of the non-faith audience, or the atheist audience, however you want to refer to it. And for that audience, I wanted to answer a question that I get all the time, which is, what is the big deal with this Jesus guy? Just Jesus this and Jesus that, which I understand. This is, after all, probably the most significant character in Western civilization over the last 2,000 years. And if you don't, believe in him, and if you don't worship him, you can understand why someone would think that, this is sort of a man whose story has been so greatly exaggerated by myth and legend that it becomes ridiculous to even try to get to know who he really was. And I wanted to answer that question because the bare-bone facts, when you look at the bare-bone facts of Jesus' life, and we can talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A, when you look at the bare-bone facts of Jesus' life, what you are talking about is an illiterate, uneducated, poorest of the poor, pious, marginal Jew from the backwoods of Galilee. The equivalent of what we nowadays would refer to as a country bumpkin, who nevertheless, based on the power of his charisma, the power of his extraordinary teachings, was able to form a movement on behalf of the poor and the dispossessed, the meek, the outcast, women especially, a movement that was seen as such a threat to the powers of his time that he was ultimately hunted down like a criminal, arrested, tortured, and executed for the crime of sedition. Call that guy Bob if you want to. That seems like a guy worth knowing. Okay? And in fact, what I really wanted to say with this book is that you do not have to be a Christian to be a follower of Jesus, just like you don't have to be a follower of Jesus to be a Christian. So that's what I really wanted to do. And I have to be honest with you, one of the greatest thrills in publishing this book is that I've received an overwhelmingly positive response, both from Christians and from atheists, non-believers, about this book. So I've managed to bring Christians and atheists together, which is no small feat. But, as Michael did mention, I have received an enormous amount of criticism from certain sectors about this book. But I want to be very clear about who that is. Yes, it's true that there are some very, very conservative evangelical Christians, people who refuse to even countenance the notion that Jesus had a context. I mean, after all, if you believe that Jesus was God, what does context have to do with it? Who cares about his time and place? His words are eternal, his actions are universal, time and place is irrelevant. I totally get that. I completely understand where that thought comes from. And so I have received some criticism from those religious quarters. But the truth of the matter is that the majority of the criticism that I've received from this book hasn't been from religious groups, it's been from political groups. And I think there's a very simple reason for that. Because the Jesus that I write about, the historical Jesus that I write about in this book, is a Jesus that these people don't recognize. And this is true, by the way, on the left and the right. When you listen to some politicians, particularly on the right, you would think that all Jesus ever talked about was guns and gays. By the way, two things Jesus never mentioned, by the way. Guns and gays. You get this a lot. I mean, it's amazing the way in which Jesus has become this kind of talking point in American politics. I mean, politicians, again, Democrats and Republicans on the left and the right, often trot out Jesus as though, he's sort of a stand-in for their political views. And it's remarkable, the kinds of views that they attribute to Jesus. I mean, there are politicians now who are saying that Jesus would be against food stamps and welfare, and so therefore we should get rid of those things. You had politicians during the healthcare debate, you had politicians saying that Jesus would be advocating universal healthcare. After all, he did go around healing people for free, so maybe that's not a bad point. It's a stretch, but it's not a bad point. You had politicians, during the run-up to the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan, talking about Jesus, wanting us to go fight against these infidels in the Muslim world, in this sort of cosmic contest over the powers of good and evil. Not too long ago, you had Rand Paul actually saying that Jesus wouldn't want us to give foreign aid to foreign countries because of the way that they, countries like in Egypt, where there are attacks against Christians. It's remarkable to me, the way in which Jesus is used as this kind of political football. Well, as I think Michael rightly noted, if Jesus were actually alive today, these same politicians who spend so much time pretending to be his spokespeople would run the other way, frankly. They would want nothing to do with this man. Because the truth of the matter is that the politics that Jesus preached were so radical, even in his time, that they led to his death. And they would certainly be the same today. Jesus did not preach equality. Jesus preached the reversal of the social order. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor, for the kingdom of God is theirs. Blessed are the hungry, for they shall be fed. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall rejoice." Those words, those blessed words of the Beatitudes, are often thought of nowadays as describing some kind of utopian fantasy that is to come. But we rarely remember what Jesus said after those words, because then he kept going and said, "Woe to the rich, for they have received their consolation. Woe to the fed, for they shall go hungry. Woe to those who rejoice, for they shall mourn. The first shall be last, the last shall be first." This is not some utopian fantasy. This is a brand new conception of a world order in which those at the top and those at the bottom switch places. And as you can imagine, this was an incredibly appealing message for those on the bottom. And a threatening message for those on the top who ended up killing him for it. And let me tell you something. If he were alive today preaching that very same thing, the very same thing would happen. Because although this is a man who spent his ministry railing against the wealthy and the powerful, the corrupt, and most importantly, the gatekeepers of salvation, those same gatekeepers still exist. In fact, he would probably spend most of his time railing against the very same people who set themselves up as his spokespeople nowadays. And so that is a Jesus that I think is incredibly threatening to a lot of people, which is why this book, and just me in general, have received so much attacks from the margins of the political sphere. But this is a Jesus that would look very familiar to most of the Quakers in this room. because it is a Jesus that we preach when we go onto the hill, when we talk about care for the poor and the dispossessed, the homeless, when we fight for peace and stability, for the reduction of arms, the removal, the disarmament of nuclear weapons. These are the values that the Jesus of history preaches, and they're the values that I think resonate in a room like this, which makes me so proud to be able to stand here before you. So I'm going to stop my introductory comments right there. We have a good 30 minutes or so for a robust Q&A. I know that there are some questions, Jim was saying, not just about the book and the historical Jesus, which I'm perfectly happy to talk about, but there's also a number of questions about the Middle East. That is an area that I've done a lot of writing and speaking about, and I know that in a group like this that's so well informed about geopolitics that it's going to be hard to avoid. So I'm open to pretty much anything.
Hi, my name is Robert. I just had a thought while you were talking about this that for me brought up sorrow, was the fact that I think if Jesus were alive today, nobody would pay much attention to him. And I would love to know your thoughts on it.
Interestingly, nobody paid that much attention to Jesus in his time either. The Gospel of Luke says that Jesus had 72 disciples. Now, we know, as I write about in this book, that there were at least a dozen other messiahs in Jesus' time, a dozen other people walking around claiming to be the Messiah. And many of them had thousands upon thousands of followers. And if, we believe the gospel, Jesus' disciples would be dwarfed by the disciples of these other messianic figures like Judas the Galilean or Hezekiah the bandit chief or Simon bar Gioria or Simon bar Kokhba. And yet, 2,000 years later, only one of those guys is still called Messiah. And there's a lot of very complex reasons for that, but I mean, it is a significant fact to bear in mind. And I wonder if the lesson to be learned from there is that, sometimes when you are engaged in what seems to be a Herculean task, and you're small in number, it feels as though that no one can hear you, that your voice is being drowned out, and that is certainly the case when you are preaching for peace and security around the world. But to me, the lesson from that, that aspect of the historical Jesus is precisely how lasting and eternal words of truth can be, regardless of how many people are speaking them. And so maybe you're right, that if Jesus were here today, he would probably be simply ignored, unless he had a good Twitter following or something, I suppose, which I imagine he would, by the way. But nevertheless, I don't think that diminishes either the truth of his teachings or the power of those teachings.
Thank you. I have read that there's evidence that there was no Jesus in a historical sense, the way we generally think of him. And I was wondering what your research indicated.
Right. Well, this is a long-standing debate in historical Jesus studies, which in and of itself is only about 200 years old. The so-called quest for the historical Jesus is quite a new endeavor, though, frankly, over the last 200 years, thousands upon thousands of scholars all over the world have done enormous research on the subject, and there's really not all that much new to say anymore, barring some great discovery that we may find. But this question of whether there actually was a person named Jesus is one that is still argued about a lot. And the reason for it is because when you take away the New Testament, there is almost no trace of the historical Jesus at all. In fact, take away the New Testament, and the earliest, most reliable mention of Jesus comes from the year 94 CE, so more than 60 years after his death. And that's a very interesting point, because the mention comes from a Jewish historian named Josephus, who's actually writing in Greek for a Roman audience. And he is telling the story of the Jewish War, this remarkable event that takes place in the year 66, where the Jews rise up in revolt. They've been rising up in revolt for 100 years against Rome, but just every time they do so, they get crushed right away. But in 66, they rise up in revolt, and it works. They actually kick the Romans out of the Holy Land, managed to keep them at bay for about 3 or 4 years, mainly because Rome is dealing with some other issue that's much more important to them, and then they remember, oh right, the Jews, and they return. And when they return, they slaughter everybody. They burn Jerusalem to the ground, they destroy the temple of God, they exile the remaining Jews who survived the massacre, and they essentially make Judaism a pariah religion. It's no longer considered a legitimate cult in the Roman Empire. By the way, one very important fact to keep in mind, that what I just said, this sort of earth-shattering apocalyptic moment that I just described, the very first gospel ever written about Jesus was written immediately after the event that I just described. It's very, very important because the context for the writing of the Gospel of Mark, the very first gospel written sometime around 70 or 71 AD, in Rome, by the way, is very important in understanding how to read it, because it is written in a way to reflect the post-Jewish revolt situation in the Roman Empire for Jews and for early Christians. Nevertheless, to go back, so Josephus is writing about this particular event. And as he's writing about it, he's writing about people that actually matter as far as Josephus is concerned. People like the Roman governor of Jerusalem, or, for instance, the high priest. And he's telling this particular story, this thing that happens in the year 62, so 4 years before the launch of the war. And what he says is that in the year 62, the Roman governor of Jerusalem, a man by the name of Festus, suddenly has a heart attack and dies. And a power vacuum opens up in Jerusalem. And Rome, recognizing the political instability in Jerusalem, sends the new governor, a man by the name of Albinus, to Jerusalem as fast as possible, but Albinus gets waylaid in Alexandria. So it's going to be a while before he can make it to Jerusalem. And as Josephus writes, at that point, the high priest was this very young man, this fiendish Sadducee, as he refers to him, by the name of Ananus. And Ananus decides that he's going to take advantage of this sort of power vacuum that arises now that the Roman governor is gone, and he's going to put to death all of his enemies, which is something that the Jews did not have any authority to do under Roman law. And so he starts putting to death all these people that he doesn't like. And Josephus says, and then he put to death James, the brother of Jesus, the one they call Messiah. And then he moves on. And he talks about Albinus, and he talks about people who matter, in other words. Now, this is a very important, extremely significant piece of evidence here, because it tells us two things. First of all, Josephus does not care about Jesus. I mean, in fact, the phrase, the one they call Messiah, in the Greek, it's quite obviously meant to be derisive. I mean, what he is saying is, the one they call Messiah. That's what he's saying. And indeed, it's not even about Jesus. It's about his brother James, who was quite a significant, fairly famous person in Jerusalem. He becomes the leader of the Jesus movement after Jesus' death, right up to the year 62. So for 30 years, he is in charge of this movement that Jesus leaves behind. But the very fact that this historian, writing to a Roman audience, in trying to explain which James he is talking about, uses his brother Jesus as his appellative. Remember, they didn't have last names there. If you said James, you would say, which James? James, the one whose brother is Jesus, the one they call Messiah. Oh, right, that James. The fact that he uses that to sort of indicate which James he means is proof that by the year 94 CE, Jesus was so well known that you could do that. You could actually say, which James I mean, the one with his brother, Jesus, that guy? Oh, right. Most scholars would say that that is pretty good proof that there was at the very least a guy named Jesus of Nazareth, and that at the very least he started this movement, this Jewish movement, sometime in the 1st century, and that at the very least, as a result of that movement, he was executed as a state criminal. But that's pretty much it. That's all we can say with any kind of confidence about the historical Jesus. He was a Jew. He lived sometime in the 1st century. He led a Jewish movement for Jews, and that as a result of that movement, Rome executed him. It's not a lot. Everything after that is sort of historical supposition, and we try to fill in the holes by placing him in his time and place and trying to make sense of what that would have meant. And then we look at the Gospels and we try to see, we take the claims of the Gospels and we analyze them according to what we know about the history of that time. And we know a lot about the history of that time thanks to the Romans, who were very, very good at documentation. That was really their strength, documentation and killing. That's where the Roman Empire and roads. Those three things that's Rome's calling card. We can kill, we can build roads, and we can write things down. So we know a lot about that time. We take the claims of the Gospels, we analyze them according to what we know about that time, and the picture of Jesus, the historical Jesus, arises. Is everyone convinced? No. There are still scholars who would say that that's not enough, and we can't know if there was a Jesus or not. But I would say that the overwhelming consensus of scholars is that, yes, there was a Jesus, and those three things are all we can know about him. Yes, sir.
I think there's a great deal of support for your entire narrative, and support and endorsement almost of the zealousness that you find in Jesus from an earlier publication dating back to 1965, the Passover Plot, which not only affirmed the zealot characteristics that you're talking of, but portrayed Jesus as being strongly intentional and purposeful in planning his entire life course in accord with prophecy to come to the events that are recorded in the Gospels. I wonder if you'd have any comments on that
Yes.
alternative but supportive documentation by Hugh Shunfield that aroused a similar amount of controversy.
Right, yes.
Perhaps steering clear, though, of the just outright contradiction of doctrine that it finally arrived to by supposing that Jesus had planned to survive the crucifixion itself.
Right. That's a very, very good question. I am familiar with the book, although I'm embarrassed to say I've never actually read it, but I am familiar with its thesis. And I would agree with you. And certainly I'm not the first person to refer to Jesus as a zealot. Let me stop for a moment and explain what this word means for those of you who have not read the book, because I understand that the word has some fairly negative connotations in our modern parlance, and it's a provocative title. It's meant to be. That's how you sell books, is that you're walking at the airport and you see zealot, that's the point of it. But zealot means something very, very specific in Jesus' time, and it did not have any kind of negative connotations. On the contrary, the vast majority of Jews of Jesus' time would have gladly and proudly referred to themselves as zealous for the Lord. All the great biblical heroes and kings and prophets in the Hebrew Bible were all known for their zealotry. Zeal is actually a very specific biblical doctrine. It's not just a word. It means something very specific in the Bible. And it actually has its roots in the nature of God. God, who is referred to in the Hebrew scriptures as a devouring fire, a jealous God. Zeal means an uncompromising devotion to the sole sovereignty of God. It is actually at the very foundation of the commandments. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. That conception is meant to indicate not just a sense of monotheism. That's a very simplistic way of looking at it. It's not just that there's only one God or that God himself is one. It's that God is the sole master. God is the only thing worth being ruled by, the only thing worth worshiping, the only sovereign. That is sort of the heart and soul of the Torah. It's a commandment that God gives repeatedly when he says, "Thou shalt have no gods but me," when he talks about himself as a jealous God, as a devouring fire. This notion of God as the sole sovereign was widespread in the first century, and in particular during the time of when the Jews found themselves occupied militarily by a bloody heathen empire, by some pagan emperor who lived thousands of kilometers away, in direct defiance, of course, of what the Torah commands. The Torah commands that this land shall be cleansed of all but the chosen people. And so during Jesus' time, during the first century, groups of Jews who were dedicated to this conception of establishing the sole sovereignty of God, who refused to bow to any master, certainly any human master, but any master other than God, called themselves zealots. And there were all kinds of different zealots. I mean, some zealots were violent and took up arms and went to war against Rome. Some zealots were far more spiritual, far more prophetic. It is in the year 66 the zealots who actually manage to kick out Rome from the Holy Land. So zealotry, again, is widespread phenomenon. And the argument of this book is that when you look at Jesus' social teachings and the political implications of his teachings, it is impossible to miss the zealotry that is in them. That what he is teaching is very much in line with what the zealots themselves were teaching. And indeed, one of the most common ways of referring to the zealots, the Roman most common way of referring to the zealot groups was lestes. They referred to them as lestes, which is a word that means bandit. Bandit was the sort of common catch-all term that the Romans used for any one of these insurrectionists or rebels. The reason I bring this up is because there's a very important clue in the Gospels that is often mistaken because of our English translation. One thing that we know about Rome is that crucifixion was a punishment that was reserved exclusively for crimes against the state. Crimes like rebellion or insurrection, sedition or treason. That's it. That's the only thing that you could be crucified for. You have to understand, crucifixion was not just some simple punishment. It wasn't like, you would steal an apple and they would crucify you for it. That's not how it worked. And indeed, crucifixion was not even a form of capital punishment for Rome. It was often the case that Rome would kill you first and then crucify you. The purpose of crucifixion was not to kill a criminal. The purpose of crucifixion was to act as a deterrent against rebellion, which is why crucifixions were always done in public, in marketplaces, at the crossroads, at the entrance to cities. Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified, was right next to the main entrance into the city of Jerusalem. What that means is that it would be impossible for you to actually enter Jerusalem without walking by thousands of people dying or dead on crosses as a reminder, just in case you forget, of what happens if you defy the will of Rome. The reason I say this is that people often say, but wait a second, wasn't Jesus crucified next to two thieves? No. The Greek word that is used in the Gospels for thief is not kleptai, which is the proper term for thieves. The word is lestai. They were not thieves, they were bandits. And bandit, as I say, is the most common term for rebel, for insurrectionist. It's not that Jesus was crucified alongside two bandits. He was one of the bandits being crucified. That's the only thing you could be crucified for. So, why do I emphasize this so much? Because if you know nothing else about Jesus except that he was crucified, you know enough to, at the very least, question this sort of dominant image of him as this kind of celestial spirit with no concern over the cares of this world, no interest in the politics or the social aspects of his day, whose only concern was with the world to come. that Jesus would have gone totally unnoticed by Rome. But if Rome finds you to be such a threat to the political and religious establishment that they hunt you down and crucify you, you're probably a troublemaker.
I have two questions for you, and you can choose not to answer the first one, but I'm interested in your faith journey right now,
Yes.
and in how you integrate your studies with your own spirituality. As many of us maybe struggle with that as well. And then the second question is, okay, if we live in the Rome of today, what are the implications for what we should be doing as people who are either interested in the historical or the potentially divine Jesus?
For Jesus, his conflict was with the powers of that be because they were powers. That's it. Because they had set themselves up as gatekeepers to salvation. That alone was enough for Jesus to fight against them. Jesus didn't say how difficult it is for the wealthy who are really, really, really bad to enter the kingdom of heaven. He said the wealthy. That's it. His beef was not with corrupt powers. It was with powers. He did not like some of the temple priests and didn't like some of them. It was the entire priestly aristocracy, which had maintained a monopoly over who gets access to God or not. It was just the fact that they had set themselves up in that way was reason enough to confront them. And I think that is something that we should remember, that it's not about Democrat or Republican. It's not about right or left. If you are in a place of power, then it is our job, if we are following the example of Jesus, to confront you, to make sure that the social justice that is at the foundation of Jesus' teachings, that notion becomes paramount to every decision that is being made. So I don't need to preach that to this audience. You're doing fine. The first part of your question, yeah, give yourself a hand, absolutely. The first part to that question, though, is a little bit more complicated. Look, it's just true. I mean, that most of my colleagues probably entered this field of religious studies from a place of faith. That's usually how it happens. And then very quickly, that faith gets sucked out of you. We always joke, when I was at the Harvard Divinity School, and people have this notion that because the word divinity is in there, that there's something divine about it. No. In fact, we jokingly say it's where faith goes to die. We would joke all the time that, because when you see at the graduation, they would shake your hand, they would hand you your diploma, and then usually they would whisper something to you. And we'd always joke that what they whispered to you was, "There is no God." And it felt like that. It felt like that sometimes. When you study the religions of the world, it's hard to take any one of them all that seriously. It's just a fact. And so for most of my colleagues, faith doesn't play any role in their lives. It doesn't really even play any role in their research. I mean, honestly, most scholars of religion look at faith the way a biologist looks at a microbe. Okay, it's like something to be studied. Look at those interesting people over there with their beliefs. I'm not like that. I'm not like that. I've never been like that. I don't have a problem with reconciling my faith with my scholarship for two reasons. I think the first reason is that I don't confuse faith with religion. That's my first thing. I mean, these are not the same thing. Religion is nothing more than a language made up of symbols and metaphors that help us define for ourselves and communicate to other people, to like-minded people, the ineffable experience of faith. Faith is indescribable. It's inexpressible. Religion helps you express it. That's what it does. And that's all it does, nothing more than that. People often ask me, you were a Muslim and then you became a Christian and then you became a Muslim again. How did your faith change? It didn't. My faith is exactly the same as it always has been. The language I use to describe my faith has changed. That's all. The symbols that I use to describe it have changed. And by the way, when I say language, I mean this in a very literal sense. You all understand what I'm saying because I'm speaking in English. If I all of a sudden broke into Arabic and kept saying the exact same thing, most of you would no longer understand what I'm saying because I'm speaking a different language. That's exactly what I mean when I say religion. When I say a language of symbols and metaphors, I mean language in the way that French is a language or that Arabic is a language. Let me do a little experiment here. I sometimes do this experiment. It may not work with this audience, by the way, but let me try this. If I said to you that I have been washed by the blood of the Lamb, raise your hand if you know what I mean. Okay? Now raise your hand if you don't know what I mean. Okay. See, it would be no different than if I had just all of a sudden started speaking Chinese. Those Chinese speakers in the audience would continue to understand me. Those who don't speak Chinese would have no idea what I'm talking about. What I just said, for those of you who understood it, who speak my language, what I just said, what I just communicated to you is something deeply profound. I just said something to you that if you speak that language, then you not only understood what I meant, but we just had a deep, deep connection. We understood each other. We understood something profoundly inexpressible. If you didn't understand my language, I mean, washed by the blood of the Lamb, what the heck are you talking about? Religion is just a language. Faith is what's important. So, why am I a Muslim? I'm not a Muslim because I think Islam is more right or Islam is more true. It's not. I'm a Muslim because the symbols and metaphors that Islam provides make more sense to me than the symbols of other religions that I am quite familiar with. I speak Christianity, I speak Judaism, I speak Hinduism in the same way that I speak Persian and Arabic and French. But I think in English. I feel in Islam. The Buddha once said that if you want to strike water, you don't dig 6 1-foot wells. You dig 1 6-foot well. Islam is my 6-foot well. But the water that I am drinking from is the water that everybody is drinking from. But the well is mine. So the first thing that I do is I never confuse faith with religion. The second thing that I do is I never confuse scripture with religion. I am flabbergasted when I hear people say things like, I believe in the Bible, or I believe in the Quran. I don't understand these terms. What do you mean? You believe they exist? So do I. I don't understand what you're saying. These are not things to believe in. They are signposts to God. They are not an end. They are a means to an end. They are not the destination. They are a path to the destination. So when I find errors and contradictions and historical inaccuracies in my scripture, my response is, yeah, of course. What is that? That has nothing to do with my faith at all. I mean, frankly, if your faith is rocked because you found out that Matthew says Jesus was born in 4 BC and Luke says Jesus was born in 6 AD, then the problem is with you, okay? The problem is with your faith. If your faith is in a text and not in what the text is talking about, you're doing it wrong.
My question is about the politics of Jesus and the extent to which the politics that Jesus ministered was not one of power politics rooted in violence, but a rejection of that power politics, and in a sense that you're calling him a zealot and also a revolutionary, was that a revolutionary nonviolence, and or not?
There is absolutely no evidence at all that he is a man who advocated armed violence or that he called for armed violence against the state. That said, the very term, I am the Messiah, has deep political implications that will absolutely lead to violence, which it did 13 other times. The other 13 people who said, I am the Messiah, it all led to violence. The Messiah means the anointed one. The job, the principal task of the Messiah as the descendant of King David is to reestablish David's kingdom on earth, to usher in the reign of God. Well, if you are claiming to be ushering in the reign of God, you are claiming to be ushering out the reign of Caesar. That is a treasonable offense. And so I think that the notion of Jesus as just this kind of inveterate pacifist is as incomplete as the notion of him as some kind of violent revolutionary. I think he had a very complex idea about the use of violence and the notion of violence. He certainly wasn't a fool. He understood what every zealot, every Jew of his time understood, which is that you do not remove the most powerful empire the world had ever seen with a sit-in. I think he got that. And indeed, there are very uncomfortable verses in the Gospels, that represent this kind of complexity about his views on violence. But I think he also understood, and understood simply by experience. I mean, in his lifetime alone, he saw 4 other messiahs come and go. And when I say go, I mean get slaughtered. So I think he understood that if he's going to say, I'm the Messiah, he knows exactly where that's going to lead. There's no question that this is a statement that leads to the cross. When Jesus says to his disciples, before he heads out to Jerusalem, if you want to follow me, take up your cross and follow me, that's not a metaphor. He means that. Where we are going leads to the cross. Do you want to come? Come on. So I think that notion should stop us from making any kind of simple statement about Jesus and his views on violence. He was a complicated man, and I think his views on violence were complicated. But he understood, I think, more than anyone else, that you're not going to remove this empire with force. You're not going to remove them with nonviolence. You're not going to remove them with force. That both of those things are useless when it comes to an empire like this. And so, I want to get spiritual here for a moment. And I am theorizing because I don't, whenever you say this is what he thought, who knows what he thought. But in my studies, I would say that what Jesus thought is that there is a different kind of violence that could actually impact this empire. And it's the violence of sacrifice. It's the notion of zealotry being the sort of commitment to sacrifice yourself. I mean, let's just face it. What Jesus did in the last 2 days of his life was insane. Okay? He spent 99.9% of his ministry in Galilee, in villages, so far away from the Roman authorities, no one even knew who he was. And then for no reason at all, one day he says, we're going to Jerusalem. And not only does he go to Jerusalem, he enters Jerusalem declaring himself to be the king. This remarkable pageant that is in all 4 Gospels, in which, surrounded by a frenzied multitude, proclaiming the coming of the king, sitting on a donkey that in fulfillment of the prophet Zechariah is how the king enters Jerusalem, having his disciples wave palm branches in the air, palm branches being the symbol of the victory of the Maccabees over the Seleucid Empire. This is a message that everyone would have understood immediately in Jerusalem. This guy is calling himself king. The first thing that he does when he enters Jerusalem is he goes to the temple and he cleanses it. Let's understand what we're talking about here. I mean, what he does in forming a whip of cords and breaking down the cages that are holding these animals for sacrifice and overturning the tables of the money changers is an act of open treason. The temple and the Roman Empire, the Roman presence, are one and the same. The governor of Jerusalem, Pontius Pilate, lives in the temple, in the Antonia fortress. along with a cohort, 500 Roman soldiers. This is an act of suicide. And indeed, it is precisely why he gets arrested and executed. And, there are two ways to think about this. Either he was just crazy, or he had an actual plan. And the plan was to get arrested and executed. And, however you want to understand that as a faith message, historically speaking, it's a hard thing to deny. It's a hard thing to overlook.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little more on what you mean when you say that religion and politics were one and the same during this time period. And also if you could talk a little bit about what inspired your earlier book, No God But God.
The temple housed the Holy of Holies. And inside the Holy of Holies, this main sanctuary, was the physical presence of God, literally. I don't mean that in a figurative way. Literally, the physical presence of God was believed to be inside the Holy of Holies. It's not that, though, they didn't believe God was everywhere. God was everywhere, but his origin was in this temple. It was from this temple that his spirit flowed to the rest of the world. And one man controlled access to the Holy of Holies, the high priest. The high priest was, by this time, nothing more than a Roman employee. This was the most lucrative job you could have in first century Palestine, which is why the high priesthood would just be passed on as a legacy by a handful of very wealthy priestly families. And the entire priesthood itself, the sort of priestly aristocracy that Jesus rebels against, had both political and religious authorities. So the high priest could make arrests in the vicinity of the temple. The high priest could pass laws insofar as the Jews were concerned, not Roman laws, but insofar as the Jews were concerned. The temple was not just the physical dwelling place of God, it was where the records of the Jewish nation were housed. It was also the largest bank. It was a bank, a repository for documents, the main cultic institution. I mean, what I mean to say is that it was everything. It was the religious, political, social, and economic center of life for the Jews, which is a great metaphor for the very concept of what religion meant in the ancient world. Religion, it was not the kind of personal confessional experience that it is in our modern world. Religion was identity. It was your citizenship. It was your ethnicity. It was your nationality. It was your tribe. It was the thing that you were. You were Roman because you were under the cult of Jupiter. You were Jewish because you were under the cult of Yahweh. And indeed, this was a time in which the very notion of a god and its tribe were considered one and the same. Very difficult concept for us to understand. But when you look at the Hebrew Bible and you see these sort of great wars that the Israelites fight, what you recognize very quickly, and by the way, this is true throughout the Near East, in the Mesopotamian text, the Babylonian text, they say this, even the Persian text, they say the same thing. It's not the tribe that's fighting on behalf of God, it's God who is fighting on behalf of the tribe. When you read the accounts of holy wars in the Hebrew scriptures, over and over again, you are reminded that the Israelites didn't do most of the fighting, that God did most of the fighting. Yeah, the Israelites showed up on the battlefield, but the enemy was killed by hailstones coming from the sky. Yeah, the Israelites fought the Egyptians, but it was God who killed the Egyptian military. This happens over and over and over again. What that means is that there is this absolutely integrated conception of a tribe and that tribe's deity, whatever that tribe may be and whatever the deity may be. By the way, one of the very interesting sort of scholarly aspects of this meant that when wars were fought, they were fought not between tribes but between gods, which means that when one side lost, it wasn't their warriors who lost, it was their God who lost. You find this even in the Hebrew scriptures. When the Israelites defeated the Canaanites, It wasn't the Israelites who beat the Canaanites. It was Yahweh who defeated Baal. When the Babylonians defeated the Israelites, it wasn't the Babylonians who defeated the Israelites. It was Marduk who defeated Yahweh. And that's a concept that you see right up to Jesus' time. If Jesus would have used the word "I am a Jew," and there's some scholarly question about whether he would have used that kind of phrasing, whether he would have said "I am an Israelite" or "I am a Hebrew," it doesn't matter. He meant the exact same thing. When he said "I am a Jew," he meant "I'm a Hebrew," ethnically. He meant "I'm an Israelite," nationally. Those things meant the exact same thing. There was no difference whatsoever. Religion, politics, economics, your social views, these were one aspect of your identity. They were the totality of who you were. No God But God, I wrote, at a time in which there was this, the war in Iraq had just started. This was a time in which there was an enormous amount of misunderstanding about Islam and the Muslim world. And what I wanted to do was, more than anything else, show people that if you look at the origins and the evolution of Islam, the one thing that you are confronted with is how unextraordinary it is that Islam is just a religion like every other religion, that it's privy to all of the good things and bad things that all religions are privy to, that it comes in 1,000 different flavors like all religions do, that there is nothing special about it. And that's, I think, a very important point to make at a time in which, for many Americans, Islam is sort of the antithesis of, America, that it is the quintessential other, that Islam is somehow different and unique and not like other religions, that Muslims aren't like people of other faith, that the same sort of historical and literary and social and cultural aspects that impact the evolution of all religions in the world have had no impact on Islam, that Islam is monolithic. And this was a book to try to prove the frankly, idiocy of that viewpoint. And I'm very happy to say that it was successful in that regard. Now, do we have a better understanding of Islam today? No, I don't think so. But I think that for a lot of people, at the very least, the sort of notion of Islam as other is making less sense today than it used to. I think, and certainly in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and hopefully, I had some small role to play in that. Thank you all very much for having me.